Several years ago, Stephen Covey wrote a book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. In this book, he said that one of the most universal patterns is that effective people have a worldview of abundance. But much of the world has a worldview of scarcity. Apparently, we tend to get these worldviews very young in life, and they don't tend to change very easily. They underlie almost everything else. Frankly, I think scarcity is a worldview I was given. I was born of parents who grew up during the Great Depression. They saw people begging and stealing and drifting with no work and no money. Men would show up on their doorstep every single night begging for food for their families and their kids. We sort of grew up hearing those stories and learning that somehow you have to protect what you have. There isn't enough to go around. And yet, they would take the time to give of what little they had to feed as many as they could. My grandparents did. We ended up hearing those stories, and we were moved, I would say, greatly, and a lot of my generation actually probably, towards anxiety, towards worry, towards a sort of a never enough mentality. We were always competing for rare resources around the house, like the last piece of cake, the only soda. It became a win-lose situation around the kitchen table. But it wasn't just around the kitchen table, it was around the country, really, at the time. And it ended up moving us in life towards anxiety, consumerism, because you can't lose. We got insecure and we got grabby. I would say if your first experience of life, if anybody's first experience of life is that they did not have enough, it makes it really hard to change, to break free of that scarcity feeling. My friends still accuse me of having in the bank my first communion money because I'm so afraid. Yet I have to say in the end, for us now, this worldview of scarcity has nothing to do, really, nothing to do anymore with being rich or poor. I know of poor people who will give you the last chicken they have if you need it, and rich people who think they still don't have enough. If you need it, what's required is a different mind, actually. The Gospels, and this Gospel in particular, is meant to give us a new mind, a not stingy mind, a mind of abundance. That is the other worldview. And sooner or later we have to choose it, and I mean choose it, because it doesn't come naturally. It's the worldview of the gospel. It says there's a big world out there with lots of potential and possibilities and more than enough. The Gospels remind us relentlessly that we have a generous God, a very generous God. Let's be honest with ourselves then, you and I. Do we look at life that way? The fruits of a generous God who's always pouring out God's own life for us? Living in a world where there's lots of potential and possibility and more than enough? Do we look at life that way? Truth is, most people don't. Most people are afraid they will not have enough. And it's that fear that freezes more than those roads were this morning, freezes them. It keeps them from taking risks. It destroys their imagination. Because of this thinking, they did not take advantage, many didn't, of the myriad possibilities and opportunities that life afforded them. They didn't take advantage of them because they were afraid they might lose everything. Fear, my friends, leads to scarcity, not to abundance. It's fear that leads us to scarcity, fear. and not to abundance. Of course, if we are dependent on a finite source, if you only have, as most of us only do, a limited amount of money, a limited amount of time, a limited amount of mind power or life, we will be driven to protect it, to hoard it. And it's so easy to look at life that way. The thought is that there's not enough of me, there's not enough for me. There's not enough goodness, there's not enough God. This is most people, and thank God it's not everybody. The worldview of abundance depends upon recognizing that you are in touch with an infinite source. If you want to have the worldview of abundance, it absolutely depends on recognizing that you are in touch with an infinite source. If you have never made contact with an infinite source, with God, you will be stingy. You will be selfish. You will guard and you will hoard and you will grab. You will be someone who's always afraid that somebody's going to take something of yours, something you earned, something along the way you think you need. And this problem is exasperated by the fact that the mind is apparently unable to imagine anything infinite, anything eternal, anything like an overflowing love. So it cannot conceive, our minds can't really conceive of an infinite love, an overflowing love, a God whose mercy is everlasting, as the psalm cries out, or a grace that builds upon grace, that builds upon grace, that builds upon grace, as John says in his gospel. Only a personal experience, only a personal experience of unconditional, unearned, infinite love and forgiveness can move us from the normal view of scarcity to the divine world of infinite abundance. Only a personal experience of infinite love can do that. That's when the doors of mercy are blown wide open. That's when we begin to understand the scale-breaking nature of grace. The theology of grace, my friends, is actually a theology of overflowing love. That's what the word grace is about, overflowing love. These multiplication stories you hear in the Gospels, one today, and we hear them 2 or 3 times a year, clearly show a worldview of abundance. When Jesus feeds the crowd, remember, with just a little, very, very little bit of food, he's revealing the nature of spiritual reality, of a deeper reality in the midst of what we call real, rather than just performing a miracle. When those apostles saw those empty nets, and Jesus said, "Set out, throw the net on the other side into the deep," they protested, as we always do before these kind of invitations, because they seem so stupid, so impractical. They fly against anything called abundance. They fly up against anything called scarcity thinking. And so when they dropped the net and it came up full, it's not just another miracle. It's a whole understanding of reality. There's a spiritual reality that is part of us, around us, in us all the time, that is abundance. And notice how the disciples always respond. They push back, they resist. They're against this invitation to abundance. How can 2 fish and 5 loaves, how can that empty net after fishing all night become full? They, like so many of us, live in a worldview of scarcity. In every multiplication story, the gospel writer emphasized that there's even stuff left over from life. We can't even handle how much is given to us all the time. There's always leftovers, which should bring that home to us, hopefully. The universe always has more than enough of itself to give. The universe always has more than enough of itself to give. And since we're part of this universe, my friends, we always have more than enough to give, you and I. And if you doubt that, simply look around. Look around at the seeds that'll be popping out soon. Look around at the life cycles of the rain and the stars. As the saying goes, there's more than enough for our need. There is never enough for our greed. There's more than enough for our need. There's never enough for our greed. You can see what's happening here. Jesus is trying to change their consciousness. He's trying to change their thinking and ours along with it. Jesus is inviting us to have true faith in a God who creates out of nothing, a God who is generous, a God who shows that where there was nothing, the nothing at the beginning from which everything came to be, the nothingness of an empty net, the nothingness of 2 loaves and a few fish. Out of that nothingness, everything comes. Everything comes. That's the pattern of divinity. That's God. There's plenty in every moment. There's plenty. There's plenty if you learn to be creative and imaginative. But it requires a complete change of thinking. Put off the old mind, the old scarcity thinking mind, and put on a mind of abundance. Imagine looking out with a new pair of eyes, different than those stingy, greedy, grabby eyes that comes with our fear, the fear that there will never be enough. Remember, fear leads to scarcity, not abundance. If you were not born, as most of us were not, with a natural view of abundance, maybe it's a gift you could ask for here at this Mass, right now. Maybe it's something you really have to choose for yourself. Maybe it's something you will only fully experience when you learn to draw upon an infinite source. If you open yourself to a personal experience of an infinite love, when you finally meet a generous God. If the source is infinite, you and I are infinite in the image and likeness of that source. If the source for us is finite, we are finite too. And the universe is finite too. It's never enough. But if the source, the God we worship right here, right now, this morning, is infinite, it's time to choose. Choose between a worldview where there's not enough or there's more than enough. And let me tell you, this is a real choice that you have to make over and over again. And make no mistake about it, it is a matter of faith.